The iron wheels screamed as the train slowed through the Texas dawn. Dust rose from the tracks like smoke from a dying world. Inside the freight cars, hundreds of German prisoners leaned toward narrow slats of sunlight, their faces pale beneath weeks of grime. They expected barbed wire, rifles, and hatred waiting beyond that door. 4 years they had marched behind banners of conquest. Now, in 1944, they were the conquered, exhausted soldiers bound for an unknown corner of America that felt as distant as another planet. When the guards swung open the doors, they saw not prison walls but open land stretching forever. Windmills turned lazily in the heat. A horse neighed somewhere beyond the station. One of the Germans whispered, half in awe, "This isn't a prison, it's a dream." They stepped down under the hot sun, expecting the bark of orders. Instead, a tall American sergeant in a dusty uniform pointed toward trucks and said in a plain, almost polite tone, "You'll be treated fairly here. Work hard, follow rules, and you'll eat like anyone else." The word struck them harder than any bullet had. It was not kindness they feared. It was the absence of cruelty. They'd been told Americans were savages, men who would starve them, beat them, humiliate them. Yet here, even the guards' boots were worn smooth from work rather than war. The trucks rumbled south through fields of waving wheat and cotton. The prisoners watched barbed fences vanish behind wild stretches of prairie. The air smelled of oil, earth, and something sweet they couldn't name. Freedom, perhaps, though none dared speak it aloud. Along the road, they passed small wooden houses where children waved, unafraid. Some of the Germans waved back, unsure if they were allowed. The sergeant only grinned. "You're safe here, boys," he said, and one prisoner, barely 19, laughed softly at the absurdity of being called boy by the enemy who had captured him. Their destination was Camp Hearn, a sprawl of barracks, watchtowers, and mess halls carved out of the Texas plains. It was no luxury, but it was clean. Each man received soap, a uniform stamped PW, and a bed with a blanket that smelled faintly of detergent and sunshine. Hot coffee filled tin cups that trembled in disbelieving hands. That night, under the hum of cicadas, they ate beans and cornbread until their stomachs ached, listening to country music faintly drifting from a guard's radio. The irony was unbearable. They were prisoners of war being fed better than many civilians in bombed-out Berlin. The days unfolded with a rhythm foreign to soldiers. Dawn, work, rest, repeat. Instead of rifles, they were handed shovels and saws. Instead of orders barked in anger, they heard the calm cadence of American foremen. They repaired fences, harvested cotton, stacked hay bales taller than themselves. Their muscles, hardened by battle, found a strange peace in labor that didn't end in blood. Some began to hum while they worked. Old marching tunes turned softer in this new land. Others stared west at the horizon where the sky swallowed the earth, wondering how a country so open could ever feel the need to fight. There were rules, of course. No leaving the grounds without escort, no letters without inspection, no defiance. But the camp's heart beat differently. A library appeared, stocked with donated English books and German classics. Classes were organized, language, math, even American history. The guards joked that by the time the war ended, the prisoners would graduate as Texans. On Sundays, they were allowed into town under supervision to help local farmers. It was then that the myth of the enemy began to crumble for both sides. One such morning, they rode out in open trucks past a small ranch near Caldwell. A hand-painted sign read Wilson Cattle Company, and below it stood a sight none of them would forget: a young woman in denim trousers and a straw hat, leading a horse out of the corral. The prisoners stared, unsure if they were witnessing a joke. In Germany, women worked in kitchens or factories, never astride a stallion with a lasso at her hip. But there she was, confident as a general, commanding both the animal and the men watching her. She caught their gaze and gave a quick, amused nod, as if acknowledging their disbelief. One POW nudged another, muttering, "Maybe that's America's secret weapon." In the weeks that followed, such encounters multiplied. Women in work shirts and sun hats delivered lunch to the fields. Teenage girls drove tractors. Some chewed gum, others carried pistols. The Germans' understanding of strength began to bend. They were men who had believed domination was power. Here they saw power in freedom. Even the way the locals laughed, loud, careless, unafraid, spoke of a strength deeper than discipline. Yet beneath this strange comfort lay an unease. Was this mercy genuine, or was it a calculated display of moral superiority? Some whispered that America wanted to prove its civilization to the world. Others, more honest, admitted they simply didn't know what to think. A few resented the kindness. It gnawed at their pride more than chains ever could. One officer wrote in his diary, "They treat us like men. It is unbearable." Still, the transformation began quietly. At night, behind barbed wire, the men talked not of battles lost but of the lives they saw beyond the fence. One described a rancher's wife teaching him how to saddle a horse. Another confessed he dreamed of owning land this vast. They traded cigarettes for English words. "Howdy, ma'am." "Much obliged." They laughed at the absurdity of it all. Nazis learning cowboy slang. Rumors spread of fraternization, though none dared cross the invisible line too far. The guards were firm but not cruel, the townspeople curious but cautious. Only the landscape itself seemed without restraint, endless plains, sunsets that burned like fire over the mesquite trees. For the Germans, it became impossible not to feel small before that horizon. It humbled them in ways no sermon could. By autumn, the camp had changed. The prisoners had built a theater, painted murals of barns and rivers, even staged plays that mocked their own arrogance. One American officer, attending a performance, remarked that if you forgot the uniforms, you'd think it a town fair. The POWs laughed freely now, though every laugh carried a shadow. Letters from home told of destruction, hunger, loss. Yet here they were, fed, safe, surrounded by a people they'd been told were monsters. The contradiction cut deep. As the first cool winds rolled in, one prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, stood outside the fence, staring toward the ranches beyond. The evening sky blazed orange and violet. "If this is our enemy," he murmured, "then we never knew the world at all." His words drifted through the camp like a confession. But just as they began to believe this strange peace might last, orders arrived. The next work detachment would go deeper into Texas, to a place where the land was wilder, and where, according to rumor, the locals weren't men at all, but women who rode like soldiers. The Germans laughed, uncertain if it was myth or madness. None of them knew that what awaited would shatter everything they thought they understood about America, and about freedom itself. The morning heat rolled over the plains like a living thing, bending the tall grass in shimmering waves. At dawn, the German prisoners had been trucked out from the camp to a ranch west of Abilene. New assignment, same uncertainty. The men sat in the back of the flatbed, uniforms marked PW, sweat glistening on their foreheads as dust coated their boots. They expected another stern American foreman barking orders, maybe an old rancher with tobacco-stained teeth. What they didn't expect was the thunder of hooves, and a woman leading the charge. She rode in like a mirage from another world. Her horse, a tall chestnut, kicked up dust that turned gold in the rising sun. She wore denim trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a cotton shirt rolled at the sleeves, and a broad-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. When she pulled the reins, the horse reared slightly, and her voice cut through the air, steady, commanding, musical. "You fellas know how to stack hay, or am I gonna have to show you myself?" For a moment no one moved. The prisoners looked to their guards, uncertain if this was mockery. One young German, Franz, barely 20, stammered, "She is a woman?" The sergeant smirked. "Welcome to Texas, son. That there's Miss Lila Wilson. You'd best do as she says." Lila dismounted, dusted her gloves, and strode toward them. Her presence carried the easy confidence of someone who'd worked the land since childhood. The German's eyes followed her, puzzled. In their world, women were nurses, secretaries, or mothers. never bosses of men. But here she was, inspecting their tools, telling them where to set the bales, where to dig fence posts, and how to handle the horses without spooking them. When Franz dropped a hay hook, she chuckled, picked it up, and said, "You'll get the hang of it, sugar." Her tone was teasing, but not cruel. By noon, the ranch pulsed with rhythm. Men sweated under the sun, hay piled high, ropes slapped against wood, and the smell of cattle hung thick in the air. From the porch, a phonograph played a scratchy tune, something lively and unapologetically American. Every now and then, the prisoners would glance toward Lila as she worked beside them, muscles flexing beneath the denim, braids swaying as she moved. She was a picture of contradiction, feminine yet fierce, gentle yet relentless. Karl, an older POW who had fought in North Africa, muttered, "In Germany, she'd be laughed at." Another, Helmet, replied quietly, "In Germany, she'd be arrested." They both fell silent, watching as she mounted her horse again, galloping off to herd a few straying cattle. She rode with a grace that seemed to mock their discipline. The way she leaned into the wind, fearless and free, left something unspoken stirring in their chests. That afternoon, when the work paused, the men sat under a large oak, drinking water from tin cups. Lila walked over with a pail of lemonade, offering it as if she were greeting guests, not enemy soldiers. "You boys hold up all right?" she asked, her accent thick with Texas drawl. The prisoners exchanged glances. They weren't sure how to respond, so Karl nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am." She grinned, wiping sweat from her brow. "Don't ma'am me like I'm your mother. Call me Lila." They didn't know whether to laugh or salute. Franz, blushing, muttered the name under his breath, as though testing it for danger. When she walked away, one of the younger men whispered, "She's not afraid of us." Another replied, "Maybe we're the ones afraid." Over the following weeks, the Germans grew accustomed to the rhythm of ranch life, and to Lila's presence at its center. She treated them with a strange, casual equality. If someone slacked off, she scolded him without hesitation. If someone did well, she said, "Good work," like it meant something. The men found themselves working harder, not from orders, but from the quiet desire to earn her respect. Even the guards noticed. "You Krauts work faster when there's a pretty face around," one of them joked, and though it was true, the feeling went deeper than attraction. It was admiration laced with confusion. At night, back in camp, the men spoke of her in hushed tones. "She rides like a soldier," Franz said. "No," Karl corrected. "Better, she rides like she doesn't need an army." They laughed softly, but behind the laughter was unease. If women in America could do what men did, what else about this country was upside down? Letters home reflected their disbelief. One POW wrote, "The women here are wild, unchained. They drive trucks, shoot rifles, and talk to men as equals. I do not know whether to be afraid or envious." Another confessed, "Today I saw a woman break a horse and smile while doing it. In that smile, I saw why we lost the war." But not every reaction was gentle. Some prisoners muttered that this was moral decay, that no society could survive without order between man and woman. Yet even as they said it, they couldn't look away when Lila rode past, sunlight glinting off her stirrup. Their certainty had begun to fracture. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the west. The sky turned green, the wind howled, and the men scrambled to secure the barn doors. Lightning split the horizon. Amid the chaos, one of the younger Germans slipped, nearly crushed beneath a sliding gate. Lila was there before anyone else, yanking the chain free and pulling him clear just as the beam crashed down. Her voice rang through the rain, sharp as a command, "Get inside before the wind takes you too." For a heartbeat, the prisoners saw not a woman, not an American, but a comrade. When the storm passed, she stood soaked to the skin, laughing. "You fellas all right?" she asked. They nodded, shivering and silent. For the first time, none of them felt like prisoners. Something had shifted. a recognition that courage didn't wear a uniform or carry a flag. It simply acted. That night, as they sat by the lanterns in their barracks, the talk was quieter. No jokes, no bravado. Just a shared understanding none could quite name. Franz finally broke the silence. Back home, they said America was weak because it let women work. They were wrong. Carl nodded slowly. Maybe strength is different here. Weeks turned into months. The fields changed color and the air cooled. The prisoners' hands grew calloused. Their English improved. Lila continued to ride with them, sometimes humming, sometimes laughing at their awkward attempts to mimic her drawl. Beneath her ease was a quiet compassion. She never asked who they were before the war, never treated them as enemies. In her world, work was the only measure of a man. But for the Germans, that very equality became its own torment. They began to wonder what they had truly been fighting for: obedience, control, fear. Here, under the vast American sky, a woman on horseback had undone years of propaganda. On their last day at the ranch, the prisoners lined up as Lila approached to say goodbye. She handed Franz a folded bandana. "You did good, kid," she said, smiling. He took it as if it were a medal. As the truck drove away, the men looked back one last time. She stood by the corral, hat tilted, sunlight catching the edge of her braid. The horizon seemed endless behind her, like freedom itself wearing denim. Back in camp, when the gates closed, the silence was heavy. Carl finally spoke what everyone felt. "They said we'd come here to learn how the enemy lives," he murmured. "But I think we've seen how humans are supposed to live." And though none of them dared to admit it aloud, they all knew that war would never look the same again. The nights had grown cooler by late autumn, and the wind that once carried dust now whispered through the mesquite with the smell of rain and wood smoke. The German prisoners sat around a fire at the edge of the ranch, the glow flickering over tired faces. Beyond the fence, coyotes howled somewhere in the dark, and the sky stretched wide and endless, so vast it felt like God had pulled the curtain from the world. They spoke softly in their native tongue, the language of soldiers who had once believed the world smaller, tighter, more controlled. But under this sky, nothing felt contained. Franz poked the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise like fireflies. "Do you think they fear us?" he asked quietly. Carl, older, leaning on his knees, shook his head. "No. They don't fear anyone. That's what makes them free." The words hung heavy in the air. The others said nothing, but their silence agreed. The workdays that followed carried a rhythm that blurred the line between duty and belonging. The prisoners no longer waited for orders. They rose with the sun, mended fences, and tended cattle alongside the ranch hands as if they'd always lived there. The guards, once shadows at the edge of every scene, now joined in with cigarettes and easy laughter. It wasn't friendship exactly, but something gentler and stranger, coexistence without suspicion. Letters home were still censored, but the men wrote carefully between the lines. "We work hard. We are treated well. The Americans are not as we were told." Some added small confessions. "I have seen a woman ride a horse as if born in the saddle. I have seen her laugh at thunder." Such sentences slipped past the censors, small acts of rebellion disguised as wonder. On the second Sunday of November, a local pastor was invited to hold service at the camp. The Germans were surprised when the Americans allowed them to attend. The preacher was a thin, gray-haired man who spoke of forgiveness, his voice soft but carrying through the wind. "Even enemies," he said, "share the same stars above." A few POWs bowed their heads. Others stared upward, searching for those same stars through the daylight haze. For men raised on loyalty and obedience, forgiveness felt like a foreign word. Yet in that moment something stirred, a quiet yearning for absolution none of them dared admit. After the service, Lila Wilson visited the camp again, bringing bread and jars of preserved peaches. She walked among the prisoners as if among neighbors, her boots crunching over gravel. When she reached Franz, she offered him a jar. "You've been working good, kid," she said. He hesitated before accepting, his hand brushing hers by accident. "Thanks," he murmured. She smiled. "You're welcome, honey." That night, Franz didn't eat the peaches. He placed the jar by his bunk and stared at it like a relic. It wasn't the food that mattered. It was the idea that someone had thought of him without demand or fear. For the first time, he realized kindness could wound as deeply as cruelty, because it stripped away every excuse for hate. In the weeks that followed, the Germans began to change in ways that defied the walls of the camp. The men who once sang war songs now hummed cowboy tunes they'd learned from the guards. They built a small stage from scrap wood and performed skits mocking their own arrogance, their former officers with exaggerated salutes. Even Karl, once proud and bitter, joined in, playing a caricature of himself to laughter and applause. For a few brief hours, they forgot uniforms, forgot the Reich, forgot the iron grip of the world they had served. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Karl stood beside Lila near the corral. "You should go home when this war is over," she said gently. "You'll have stories to tell." He looked out across the plains. "I'm not sure home will want to hear them," he said. She studied him for a moment, then replied, "Tell them anyway." Her tone wasn't pity, it was faith, quiet and steady. As winter crept closer, the camp changed again. New shipments of prisoners arrived, harder men, officers who still clung to the old arrogance. They sneered at the relaxed guards, mocked those who smiled at Americans. "You've gone soft," one spat at Franz. "You forget who you are." Franz looked him in the eye and answered, "Maybe I'm starting to remember." The tension simmered. The newcomers whispered of escape, of loyalty to the Führer. But most of the old hands had no appetite for rebellion. They'd seen too much, learned too much. At night, the debate would flare in hushed arguments, the meaning of pride, the worth of obedience, the shape of freedom. One evening, Karl silenced them all. "In Germany I was told obedience was strength. But here I see strength in laughter, in forgiveness, in women who ride horses and men who show mercy. If that's weakness, I'd rather be weak." No one argued after that. December brought frost and long night. The camp's Christmas celebration was permitted under guard supervision. The Americans decorated a tree with makeshift ornaments. The Germans built a small nativity from hay and twine. That evening, both sides shared coffee and biscuits, their laughter carrying softly into the cold. Someone played Silent Night on a harmonica. When the guards joined in the singing, in German, the prisoners' eyes filled with something they couldn't name. Later, sitting by the dying fire, Franz turned to Karl. "Do you think they hate us?" Karl smiled faintly. "I think they've decided not to." When spring returned, the land came alive again, wildflowers bursting through the hard soil, rivers swelling from melted snow. The Germans watched calves being born, helped repair barns, and built new irrigation ditches. The work was endless, but no longer felt like punishment. One of the guards joked, "You boys are turning into ranch hands," and for once, no one denied it. Yet beneath the peace, unease lingered. They knew the war was nearing its end. Radio broadcasts hinted at Germany's collapse. The thought of returning to a broken homeland filled them with dread. How could they go back to rubble after this? To the narrow streets, the ash, the silence of defeat. Here, even captivity had air to breathe. On the last day of May, as thunderheads gathered far on the horizon, Lila rode out to the edge of the camp one final time. The guards allowed her to speak through the fence. "They say the war's near done," she said. "You'll be going home soon." The men crowded near, faces lit with both hope and sorrow. "You've worked hard. You've earned your peace." She paused, her voice softer now. "Just, don't forget what you saw here." As she turned to ride away, Franz called out, "Lila?" She looked back. He hesitated, searching for words beyond his broken English. "You showed us." He stopped, the rest caught in his throat. She smiled. "No, sweetheart, you found it yourselves." Then she touched her hat, spurred her horse, and vanished into the setting sun. The men stood in silence long after she was gone. The sky above them stretched wide and blue and infinite. Somewhere deep within, something irreversible had shifted. That night, Carl sat by the fence, staring out into the darkness where her horse had disappeared. "She was right," he whispered. "We didn't find freedom in their mercy. We found it in ourselves." But freedom, they would soon learn, was not the same as home. The morning they were told they were going home, the camp was silent. No shouts, no laughter, no music from the guard's radio, only the low murmur of disbelief rippling through the barracks. The war in Europe had ended months ago, but for the men who had lived under the wide Texas sky, the news didn't feel like victory or loss. It felt like displacement. The same trucks that had once brought them here now waited beyond the gate to carry them away, engines idling in the dawn light. The air smelled of dust and damp wood, of coffee brewing for the last time. Franz sat on the edge of his bunk, the bandana Lila had given him folded neatly in his hands. Its edges were worn from being held too often, as if it had absorbed every thought he couldn't say aloud. Carl stood near the window, looking out at the fading stars. "You should be happy," Franz said quietly. "We're going home." Carl didn't turn. "Home," he echoed, the word heavy. Carl didn't turn. "Home," he echoed, the word heavy. "Tell me, what is left there to go back to?" Neither man had an answer. Outside, the guards moved with a strange gentleness. They handed out rations for the journey, bread, apples, tins of beans. "You fellas take care," one of them said, his voice catching slightly. Over the months, boundaries had blurred. Enemies had become men with names and small habits, one who hummed while fixing fences, another who drew horses in the dust with a stick. The departure felt less like release and more like tearing roots from soil. A whistle blew. The prisoners filed out, each carrying the same government-issued duffel that now held far more than belongings. It held pieces of an unwanted education, how kindness could be stronger than command, how freedom could exist even behind a fence. As they marched past the watchtower, someone began to hum Silent Night. Others joined in, voices soft and uncertain. The guards didn't stop them. At the edge of the camp, the trucks waited. Lila was there, sitting astride her horse, the brim of her hat pulled low against the morning glare. When she saw Franz, she smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd let y'all leave without saying goodbye," she said. Her voice wavered only slightly. Franz stepped forward, holding out the folded bandana. "I give it back," he said awkwardly. "It belongs here." She shook her head. "No, sugar. It's yours now. So you don't forget the sunshine." Behind them, Carl approached, hatless and solemn. "Miss Wilson," he said, "thank you for everything." She met his eyes and nodded. "You earned every bit of it." For a long moment no one moved. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint clatter of chains from the trucks as the soldiers prepared to load up. Finally, Lila dismounted and handed Franz a small envelope. "Some photos," she said softly. "One of the camp, one of the ranch. You tell folks back home what you saw here." He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "They won't believe me." She smiled. "Then make 'em." The first truck roared to life, and the men began to climb aboard. The wheels crunched over gravel, stirring clouds of dust that blurred the horizon. Lila stood with her arms crossed, watching as the faces she'd come to know disappeared behind the rising haze. For a heartbeat, her eyes met Franz's through the wooden slats of the truck bed. He raised the bandana slightly in farewell, and she tipped her hat in reply. The convoy rolled out of the camp and onto the open road. The land stretched endlessly, sun spilling across it like molten gold. Franz leaned against the railing, watching the fence recede until it was nothing but a thin line against the horizon. No one spoke for a long time. When Carl finally did, his voice was low. "Strange, isn't it? We came here as prisoners, and now it feels like we're leaving as exiles." Hours passed. The trucks rattled through small towns where children waved and women in aprons stood on porches, smiling at the passing soldiers. To the locals, it was closure. To the Germans, it was the slow unraveling of a chapter they hadn't known they were living until it was ending. By dusk, they reached the train station where boxcars waited to carry them east. The Americans handed out last papers, shook hands awkwardly. One guard, a young corporal with freckles, said, "Good luck, fellas. No hard feelings, huh?" Carl looked at him, then extended his hand. "No," he said quietly. "No hard feelings. Only lessons." As night fell, the prisoners boarded the train. Inside, the air was thick with memories. Some stared out the narrow windows, others clutched small tokens, a postcard, a photograph, a bit of Texas soil wrapped in paper. The train jerked forward, wheels clanking like a slow heartbeat. Through the slats, Franz could still see faint lights on the plains, and for a moment, he imagined the ranch, Lila riding beneath the moon, the cattle grazing in the distance, the wind alive with the smell of rain and mesquite. He whispered to himself, "She will forget us." But even as he said it, he knew she wouldn't. Days turned into weeks. They crossed the ocean, the same Atlantic they had once imagined as a barrier between civilization and chaos. Now it felt like a grave of everything they'd believed. When they finally arrived in Germany, the contrast was brutal. Cities were husks of stone and smoke. Streets where children had played were silent. The air carried the ash of what had been faith turned fanaticism. Franz walked through the ruins of Hamburg, the bandana still tucked in his pocket. He saw hollow-eyed civilians scavenging through rubble, and he understood that the defeat was not just military, it was moral. Carl found his wife's name on a list of the dead. Others found nothing at all. The men who had survived America found themselves foreigners in their own land, unable to explain the world they'd seen across the ocean. In the years that followed, some wrote about their captivity, not with bitterness but with quiet reverence. They spoke of the generosity of guards, of the fairness of townsfolk, of cowgirls who carried rifles and kindness in equal measure. They described how the enemy had given them a glimpse of a freer way to live. For some, it changed everything. Carl became a teacher. Franz, years later, returned to Texas under a work visa, unable to stay away from the land that had redefined him. When he finally found the Wilson Ranch again, it was smaller, quieter, but still alive. Lila was older, her hair streaked with gray. She recognized him at once. "Well, look what the wind blew back," she said. He smiled, unable to find words. They spoke until the sun dipped low, reminiscing about hayfields and storms, about music on the porch and laughter that had bridged worlds. Before he left, she handed him another bandana, red this time. "You wore the old one thin," she said. "Take this one for the road." When Franz walked away, the wind lifted behind him, carrying the faint smell of horses and wildflowers. He turned once to look back and saw her standing there, framed against the setting sun, the same silhouette that had haunted his dreams for years. Later, as the train carried him away again, he opened the window and let the bandana flutter in the wind. It whipped and danced above the plains until it vanished into the wide sky, where borders and wars meant nothing. And somewhere deep inside, he knew he had left not as a prisoner, nor even as a visitor, but as someone who had finally understood what freedom looked like when it smiled.